The candle on the long table flickered as Alira's hand shook. She had one chance to cross the room before the guards noticed her, and if she failed, she would not live to see the sunrise. The great hall of the Alpha King was filled with the low murmur of voices, the clink of goblets, and the smell of roasted meat. But none of that mattered to her now. What mattered was the folded scrap of paper hidden in her palm, damp from her own sweat, carrying 6 words that could break the kingdom apart. She had heard it only an hour before, standing behind a stone pillar in the west corridor, holding a tray of wine she was meant to deliver to the guest chambers. 2 voices had drifted from the shadowed alcove near the armory, low and careful, the kind of voices that only speak secrets when they believe no one is listening. One of those voices belonged to Kale, the beta of the kingdom, the king's oldest friend and his most trusted commander. The other voice was unfamiliar, rough and clipped, carrying the accent of the northern borderlands, the territory of wolves who had never bowed to King Draven's rule. "The gates will be open when the moon is highest," the stranger had said. "Your king will not even see it coming." "He trusts me with everything," Kale had answered, and there had been something cold in his tone, something Alira had never heard from him before. "He will not suspect a thing until it is too late." Alira had frozen behind the pillar, her tray trembling in her hands, wine sloshing dangerously close to the rim of the goblets. She had wanted to run, to pretend she had heard nothing, to go back to her small room above the kitchens and forget every word. But she could not. If she said nothing, an entire kingdom of people who had never done her harm would suffer for her silence. Servants, soldiers, children in the lower village, all of them would pay the price for a war they never chose. So she had done the only thing she could think of. She found a scrap of parchment meant for kitchen orders, and with a trembling hand and a stub of charcoal she kept in her apron for marking supply crates, she wrote 7 words in shaking letters. Then she folded it as small as she could and pressed it into her palm, and she walked toward the high table where the king sat, flanked by his guards, his golden eyes sharp and watchful even as he laughed at something one of his nobles had said. Alira was not important. She was a maid, one of dozens who moved through the castle like shadows, seen only when something was needed and forgotten the moment the task was done. No one looked twice at a servant carrying a tray toward the king's table. That was exactly why she could do what she was about to do. She stepped forward with the tray, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain someone would hear it. She lowered herself in a practiced bow beside the king's chair, setting down a fresh goblet of wine as she had done 100 times before. And in that single heartbeat, as her hand brushed against the edge of the table, she let the folded note slip from her palm into his. King Draven did not flinch. He did not even glance down. Years of ruling a kingdom surrounded by enemies had taught him to notice everything, without revealing that he had noticed anything at all. His fingers closed around the small piece of paper as smoothly as if he had simply adjusted his grip on the table's edge. Only his eyes moved, lifting for the briefest moment to meet hers. Alira's breath caught. She had expected suspicion, anger, perhaps even the flash of teeth that marked an alpha's warning. Instead, she saw only a flicker of curiosity, gone as quickly as it appeared. Then she rose, bowed again, and stepped back into the crowd of servants near the wall, disappearing into the ordinary rhythm of the feast, as if nothing had happened at all. She did not dare look back at the table again. She busied herself refilling cups, clearing empty plates, moving through the hall with the practiced invisibility of someone who had spent her whole life being unseen. But her mind was racing. What if he threw the note aside without reading it? What if a guard had seen the exchange and reported it to Kale before the king even had the chance to open his hand? What if the words she had chosen were not enough to convince him? She had written only this: "Your beta betrayed you. They are already waiting." It was not much. She had not had time to explain the alcove, the stranger's voice, the plan to open the gates when the moon rose high. She had barely had time to write anything before she needed to move, before staying still any longer would have drawn attention. She could only hope that the king was clever enough, or desperate enough, to want to know more. Across the hall, Draven set his goblet down and let his gaze drift casually over the room, the way any king might look out over a feast, checking that all was well among his people. But his mind was no longer on the wine or the music or the laughter of his nobles. His fingers were curled tightly around the small piece of paper hidden beneath the table's edge, and his thoughts had already begun turning over every possibility. He had known Kale since they were boys running through the forests below the castle, long before either of them understood what it meant to carry the weight of a pack on their shoulders. Kale had stood beside him through every battle, every loss, every difficult decision a king had to make. He had pulled Draven from the edge of death more than once, had guarded his back when enemies circled from every direction, had never once given him reason to doubt his loyalty. To even consider that Kale might be capable of betrayal, felt like tearing something apart inside his own chest. And yet, a king who ignored a warning, no matter how strange or unlikely, was a king who did not survive long. Draven had learned that lesson many times over the years, sometimes through the deaths of people he cared about, sometimes through near misses that still haunted his dreams. He would not make that mistake again. Whatever this note meant, whoever had written it, he needed to know more before he could decide what to believe. He waited until the feast wound down, until the nobles began drifting toward their chambers and the musicians packed away their instruments, before he finally allowed himself to unfold the paper beneath the table. He read the words twice, memorizing them, then closed his hand around the parchment and slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat. 7 words. That was all he had to go on. 7 words from an unknown hand, and a warning that struck at the very center of everything he trusted. He rose from his chair, nodding to the guards who fell into step behind him as he always did at the end of a feast, and made his way toward his private chambers at the top of the eastern tower. But instead of retiring for the night as he usually would, he paused at the door and turned to the guard captain standing nearest him, a broad-shouldered man named Nathan, who had served the castle for nearly a decade. "Find out who delivered wine to my table tonight," Draven said quietly, his voice low enough that only Nathan could hear. "The last maid before the 3rd course. I want to know her name by morning." Nathan's brow furrowed slightly, curiosity flickering across his face, but he had served long enough to know better than to ask questions his king did not offer answers to. He simply nodded and disappeared down the corridor to begin his quiet search. Draven entered his chambers and closed the heavy door behind him, the sound echoing through the empty stone room. He crossed to the window that overlooked the castle grounds, the moon hanging low and silver over the dark shapes of the training yards and the outer walls beyond. Somewhere out there, if the note was to be believed, enemies were already gathering, waiting for a signal that would open the gates from within. He pulled the note from his pocket again and read it once more beneath the moonlight. "Your beta betrayed you, they are already waiting." He thought of Kale's face at dinner that very night, calm and familiar, laughing at the same jokes he always laughed at, offering the same easy company he had offered for 20 years. Nothing about him had seemed different. Nothing about him had seemed wrong. But then, Draven reminded himself, that was exactly what made a truly dangerous betrayal so dangerous. It never looked like betrayal until it was too late to stop it. He would not act rashly. He would not confront Kale based on a single unsigned note from a source he did not yet know, but he would not ignore it either. Somewhere in this castle, someone had risked everything to warn him, and that alone told him the danger was real enough to matter. He needed proof. He needed eyes on Kale that Kale himself would never suspect, and he needed to understand exactly who had chosen, at great personal risk, to slip a warning into the hand of their king. He did not sleep well that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the maid's face, pale and frightened, bowing quickly beside his chair before vanishing into the crowd. He tried to recall her features clearly, the shape of her eyes, the color of her hair beneath her plain servant's cap, but the memory blurred, overwhelmed by the noise and motion of the feast around her. He had looked at hundreds of servants over the years without truly seeing any of them. Now he found himself wishing he had paid more attention. By the time the first light of morning touched the tower windows, Draven had made his decision. He would move carefully. He would trust no one fully until he understood the full shape of the threat before him, not even the man who had stood at his side for 2 decades. And somewhere in the lower halls of the castle, he needed to find the maid who had risked her life to warn him, before anyone else discovered what she had done. Down in the servants' quarters, Elira lay awake on her narrow cot long after the castle had fallen silent, staring up at the cracked stone ceiling above her bed. Her heart still had not slowed since the moment she had pressed that note into the king's hand. Every creak of the old building, every distant footstep in the hallway outside her door sent a fresh wave of fear rushing through her chest. She thought of Kale's voice in that alcove, cold and certain, discussing the fall of his own king as easily as one might discuss the weather. She thought of the stranger's accent, rough and unfamiliar, promising that the gates would open when the moon stood highest. And she thought of Draven's eyes meeting hers for that single, terrifying heartbeat, wondering what he had seen there, wondering if he had understood even a fraction of what she had tried to tell him. She did not know if her warning would be enough. She did not know if the king would believe a stranger's scrawled note over the word of the man who had stood beside him for years. All she knew was that she had done what she could, and now the fate of everything rested in hands far more powerful than her own. Somewhere beyond the castle walls, in the shadow of the northern hills, other forces were already moving, counting down the nights until the moon rose full and high, believing that their plan remained hidden from every eye that mattered. They did not know that a single maid, unnoticed and unimportant to everyone around her, had already begun to unravel everything they had worked so carefully to build. The war for the kingdom had not yet begun in blood, but it had already begun in secrets, and Elira, without meaning to, had placed herself directly in the middle of it. She thought about her mother, gone 3 winters now, who used to tell her that courage was not the absence of fear but the choice to act despite it. Elira had always believed those were simply comforting words meant to soften the hardship of a servant's life, words with no real weight behind them. Now, lying in the dark with her pulse still racing, she understood for the first time what her mother had truly meant. She had been terrified in that hallway. She was terrified still, and yet she had acted anyway, because the alternative had felt far worse than any fear she carried. Down the corridor, another maid named Grace turned in her sleep, and murmured something unintelligible before falling still again. Grace had worked beside Elira for nearly 2 years, sharing meals, sharing gossip, sharing the small comforts that made castle life bearable. Elira almost wished she could wake her friend and tell her everything, if only to feel less alone with the weight pressing down on her chest. But she could not risk it. The fewer people who knew what she had done, the safer everyone would be, including Grace. Elira closed her eyes at last, as the first pale light of dawn crept through the narrow window above her cot. She did not know what the coming days would bring. She did not know whether the king would seek her out, whether Cale would grow suspicious that his plans had been overheard, or whether the whole castle would soon be thrown into chaos before anyone could stop it. All she could do now was rise with the sun, return to her duties, and wait. Somewhere above her, in the tallest tower of the castle, King Draven stood at his window still, watching the horizon change from black to gray to gold, turning the note over in his mind again and again, until the words felt carved into his memory. He did not yet know the maid's name. He did not yet know the true scope of the danger closing in around him, but he knew, with the certainty of a man who had survived every kind of threat a kingdom could offer, that something dark was moving beneath the surface of his own court, and he intended to find it before it found him first. Nathan found her by mid-morning. He did not approach her directly, for he understood the value of patience when a king asked for silence, and instead spent the early hours quietly asking the head of the kitchen staff which servants had been assigned to the high table the previous night. The answer came easily enough, since the roster was kept in a ledger by the pantry door, and within it he found a single name written beside the hour of the 3rd course: Elira. He watched her from a distance for a while before making his approach, observing how she moved through her duties with a quiet, careful efficiency, never drawing attention to herself, never lingering longer than necessary in any one place. She scrubbed pots in the kitchen, carried linens to the laundry room, and helped an older servant named Rosa carry firewood up the narrow back stairs, all without a single complaint or a moment of rest. She was, by every outward appearance, an entirely unremarkable young woman, exactly the kind of person no one would ever suspect of holding a secret, capable of shaking the foundations of the kingdom. When Nathan finally found a moment alone with her near the well behind the kitchens, he kept his voice low and his manner calm, careful not to alarm her more than necessary. "The king wishes to speak with you," he said simply. "Tonight, after the evening meal, in his private study. Come alone, and tell no one where you are going." Elira felt the color drain from her face. She had expected this, had known deep down that the king would not let the matter rest, yet hearing the words spoken aloud still sent a fresh wave of fear through her chest. She managed only a small nod, her throat too tight for speech, and Nathan studied her for a long moment before offering a small, unexpected softness in his expression. "Whatever this is about," he said quietly, "the king does not summon servants to punish them without cause. If you have done something worth fearing, you would already know it. Do not assume the worst before you have reason to." It was, she realized later, a strange kind of comfort, offered by a man who did not know what she had done, but seemed to sense that she was carrying something heavy. She thanked him quietly and returned to her work, though her hands trembled slightly for the rest of the afternoon, and she found it nearly impossible to focus on even the simplest tasks. The hours crawled by with unbearable slowness. She scrubbed the same section of floor twice without noticing, folded a stack of linens crookedly, and had to redo them, and nearly dropped an entire tray of dishes when a door slammed somewhere down the hall. Grace noticed her distraction almost immediately and pulled her aside during a rare, quiet moment in the pantry. "You look like you have seen a ghost," Grace said, concern plain in her voice. "What is wrong with you today?" Elira forced a smile and shook her head. "Just tired. I did not sleep well." Grace did not look entirely convinced, but she let the matter drop, too busy with her own duties to press further. Elira was grateful for that small mercy, though guilt gnawed at her for keeping such an enormous secret from someone she considered a true friend. She told herself it was for Grace's own safety, that ignorance would protect her if things went badly, but the reasoning did little to ease the discomfort of the lie. Meanwhile, in the eastern wing of the castle, Kale moved through his own day, with the same easy confidence he always carried, unaware that his king's suspicion had already begun to circle around him like a slow, patient predator. He met with the castle guards to review the watch schedule, discussed supply shipments with the quartermaster, and spent a portion of the afternoon sparring with a group of younger warriors in the training yard, offering guidance and correction with the practiced ease of a man who had trained soldiers for most of his adult life. To anyone watching, Kale appeared exactly as he always had, a loyal commander devoted to the strength and safety of the kingdom he served. But Draven, observing from a shaded balcony above the training yard, found himself studying his old friend with new and uncomfortable scrutiny. He watched the way Kale corrected a young warrior's stance, the way he laughed at a joke shared among the soldiers, the way he moved through the yard with total ease and familiarity. Nothing about him betrayed even the faintest hint of guilt or deception. That, Draven thought grimly, was precisely what made this so difficult. If Kale truly intended betrayal, he would need to be extraordinarily skilled at hiding it, and unfortunately, skill was something Kale had never lacked. Draven had personally trained him in the art of concealment during their younger years, teaching him how to mask emotion during negotiations with hostile packs, how to keep a calm expression, even when every instinct screamed to act. If Kale had turned those same skills against his own king, there would be no easy way to detect the deception through observation alone. Draven spent the remainder of the day quietly gathering information through channels Kale would never suspect. He spoke briefly with Edward, his elderly advisor who had served 3 generations of kings before him, asking careful, indirect questions about recent troop movements along the northern border. Edward, sharp as ever despite his age, noted a slight increase in scouting reports from that direction over the past month, though nothing alarming enough to have drawn official attention before now. He also sent a trusted scout named Adam to quietly observe the northern border territories, instructing him to report back anything unusual, no matter how small it seemed. Adam had served the kingdom for years without drawing attention to himself, precisely the kind of quiet, capable soldier Draven needed for a task requiring absolute discretion. Edward, sensing that his king carried more weight on his shoulders than he had openly revealed, lingered after their conversation about the border reports, choosing his next words with the particular care of an advisor who had earned the right to speak plainly after decades of loyal service. "Something troubles you beyond simple curiosity about scouting patterns," he observed quietly. "You have never asked such careful, indirect questions about routine border matters before, not unless something specific had already caught your attention." Draven studied his old advisor for a long moment, weighing how much he could safely share even with someone whose loyalty had never once wavered across 3 generations of service to the crown. "I have received information," he said finally, choosing his words with deliberate care, suggesting that a threat may exist closer to this castle than any of us have previously considered. "I am not yet prepared to name its full shape, not until I understand more clearly whether the information can be trusted." Edward's expression sharpened with immediate concern. Though he did not press for details he understood his king was not yet ready to share. "Whatever you require of me," he said simply, "you have only to ask. I have served long enough to know that a king's caution, however mysterious it may appear from the outside, rarely arises without genuine cause behind it." This exchange, brief as it was, offered Draven a small measure of comfort during a day otherwise filled with mounting unease. He understood that he could not yet involve Edward fully in the details of Illyra's warning, not until he had gathered enough independent confirmation to justify drawing his oldest and most experienced advisor into a matter that might, if handled poorly, tear apart the very foundation of trust that held his closest circle together. But knowing that Edward stood ready to help, whenever the moment came that his full involvement became necessary, eased some portion of the isolation Draven felt as he carried this dangerous secret largely alone. He spent the remaining hours of that long day moving through his usual routine, with careful normalcy, meeting briefly with merchants regarding upcoming trade concerns, reviewing minor disputes among the household staff that required his attention, and maintaining throughout every interaction the same composed, unremarkable demeanor that had always characterized his approach to governance. No one observing him that day would have suspected that beneath his calm exterior, his mind turned constantly toward the small folded note hidden within his coat pocket, and the uncertain, dangerous path that note had already set in motion. By the time evening arrived, Draven had assembled a small collection of troubling details, none of them conclusive on their own, but together forming the shape of something far more serious than he wanted to believe. Increased scouting along the border, a note warning of betrayal from within his own court, and Kale, moving through his days with perfect calm, giving no outward sign of anything wrong at all. When the evening meal ended and the great hall began to empty, Draven retreated to his private study at the top of the eastern tower, a quiet room lined with old books and maps, lit by a single fire crackling in the stone hearth. He dismissed his guards from the immediate corridor, wanting no witnesses to the conversation he was about to have, and waited in tense silence for the soft knock that would announce his visitor's arrival. Elira arrived exactly on time, her hands folded tightly in front of her apron, her eyes downcast in the respectful posture expected of any servant summoned before the king. She had rehearsed what she might say a dozen times throughout the day, yet standing now at the threshold of his study, every carefully prepared word seemed to vanish from her mind entirely. "Close the door," Draven said quietly, and she obeyed, her fingers trembling slightly on the heavy handle. "Sit, if you wish. This conversation may take some time." She remained standing instead, too nervous to accept such an unusual courtesy, and Draven did not press the matter. He studied her for a long moment in the firelight, taking in details he had missed entirely during the chaos of the feast the night before. She was younger than he had expected, perhaps not yet 20, with dark hair pulled back beneath her cap and eyes that carried far more weariness than someone her age should already possess. "Tell me everything," he said finally, his voice gentler than she had anticipated. "From the beginning. Leave nothing out, no matter how small it may seem." And so, with her voice shaking only slightly, Elira began to speak, describing the corridor near the armory, the tray of wine she had been carrying, the two voices drifting from the shadowed alcove where she had frozen in place, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. She described Kale's voice, cold and certain, and the stranger's rough northern accent, and the words that had chilled her blood the moment she heard them. "The gates will be open when the moon is highest. Your king will not even see it coming." Draven listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, though something tightened behind his eyes with every new detail she offered. When she finished, silence settled over the study, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire and the distant sound of wind moving through the tower windows. "Why did you come to me?" he asked quietly, instead of staying silent. "You must have known the risk you were taking." Elira hesitated before answering, choosing her words carefully. "Because silence would have made me part of it," she said. "I could not carry that. Whatever happens to me now, I could not have lived knowing I said nothing, while an entire kingdom paid the price." Draven studied her for a long moment, something shifting subtly in his expression, though she could not quite name what it was. Whatever he had expected from this meeting, it had not been quite this. A servant girl willing to risk everything not for reward or recognition, but simply because she could not bear the weight of silent complicity. "You understand," he said slowly, "that what you have told me tonight cannot leave this room. If Kale learns that his plans were overheard, he may act sooner than we are prepared for, or he may simply disappear before we have gathered enough proof to move against him properly. Your safety, and possibly the safety of this entire kingdom, depends on absolute discretion from this moment forward." "I understand," Elira said quietly, and she meant it completely. Draven nodded slowly, then rose from his chair and moved toward the window, looking out over the darkened grounds below, the same view he had studied the night before, while turning her note over in his hands. "Then we begin carefully," he said, more to himself than to her. "We watch, we wait, and when the moment comes, we will be ready before they even realize we know." Behind him, Elira remained silent, her heart still pounding, though a small measure of relief had begun to settle over the fear that had gripped her for the past full day. The king believed her. Whatever came next, she was no longer carrying this secret entirely alone. 3 days passed before Kale noticed anything was wrong, and even then, it began as nothing more than a faint, nagging sense that something in the castle had shifted. He could not name it precisely. The guards still greeted him with the same respect they always had. The king still met with him each morning to discuss matters of state, still asked his opinion on troop placements and border patrols, still laughed at the same old stories they had shared for years. Yet beneath the familiar rhythm of castle life, Kale sensed a quiet undercurrent of something watchful, something careful, though he could not point to a single moment that confirmed his suspicion. It began with small things. A guard he did not recognize stationed near the northern gate, where the rotation had remained unchanged for months. A scout named Adam, whom Kale rarely saw within the castle walls, suddenly present at 3 separate meals within the same week. Draven asking, almost in passing, whether Kale had heard anything unusual from contacts along the border, a question that seemed innocent enough on its surface but lingered strangely in Kale's mind long after their conversation ended. Kale was not a foolish man. He had spent 2 decades at Draven's side, learning to read the subtle signals that separated genuine calm from careful performance, and he began to wonder, with mounting unease, whether the same skills he had used to protect his king for years were now being turned quietly against him. He told himself he was imagining things, that years of loyal service had earned him more trust than idle suspicion, yet the feeling refused to leave him entirely. He decided to test the waters carefully. During one of their morning meetings, as Draven reviewed reports from the Western Territories, Cale mentioned, seemingly by chance, that he intended to travel toward the northern border within the week to inspect the outer watchtowers personally, a routine task he had performed many times before without any special notice being taken of it. Draven's response was measured, calm, entirely unremarkable on its surface, yet Cale noticed a fraction of a pause before the king answered, a small hesitation that would have meant nothing under ordinary circumstances, but now struck him as deeply significant. "Of course," Draven said easily. "Take whatever escort you need. The northern watchtowers have not been properly inspected in some time." It was, by any reasonable measure, an unremarkable exchange, and yet Cale left the meeting with a cold knot forming in his stomach, certain now that something had changed, though he still could not identify exactly what. He needed to reach his contacts sooner than planned. If suspicion truly had begun to gather around him, delay would only increase the danger, both to himself and to the careful arrangement he had spent months building with the northern packs. He sent word that same evening through a trusted messenger, a young warrior named Oliver who had served under him for several years and had never once questioned the tasks Cale assigned him, requesting an urgent meeting at the usual location beyond the eastern ridge, 2 nights earlier than originally planned. Unbeknownst to Cale, Oliver was not quite as unquestioning as he appeared. The young warrior had grown increasingly uneasy over the past several weeks, troubled by the secrecy surrounding certain messages he had been asked to deliver, messages that spoke in vague, careful language about arrangements and timing that never fully explained themselves. He had said nothing, assuming his commander had reasons beyond his understanding, the way any loyal soldier trusted the judgment of those above him. But the growing unease had not entirely disappeared, and when Nathan approached him quietly one evening with careful, probing questions about Cale's recent activities, Oliver found himself, after a long hesitation, admitting more than he had originally intended. "He has been sending messages north," Oliver admitted quietly, his voice low with the particular discomfort of a man beginning to suspect his loyalty had been misplaced. "I do not know what they say. He never lets me read them, but he has grown careful about it recently, more careful than before." Nathan relayed this information to Draven within the hour, and the king absorbed it with the same controlled calm he had maintained since the night Alira first placed her warning into his hand. Every piece of information confirmed what he already suspected, yet each confirmation still landed with the particular weight of betrayal from someone he had trusted completely for most of his life. That night, Draven summoned Alira once more to his private study, wanting her continued insight into the situation as it developed, though he was careful this time to ensure her arrival and departure drew no attention whatsoever. She came through a side passage rarely used by castle staff, her heart still racing each time she made this journey, though the fear had begun to shift slowly into something closer to quiet determination. "Cale grows suspicious," Draven told her plainly, seeing no reason to soften the truth from someone who had already proven her courage far beyond what her position required. "If he suspects that his plans have been discovered, he may accelerate whatever timeline he originally intended. We may have less time than we believed." Alira absorbed this information with a steady expression that surprised even herself. The fear had not vanished entirely, but something had hardened beneath it over the past several days, a quiet resolve she had not known she possessed until circumstances demanded it of her. "What do you need from me?" she asked simply. Draven studied her for a long moment before answering. "Your position allows you to move through the castle without drawing suspicion, in ways my guards cannot. If you notice anything unusual, any conversation, any unfamiliar face, any change in routine among the staff who serve Cale directly, I need to know immediately." "I understand," Alira said, and this time there was no hesitation in her voice at all. Over the following 2 days, she moved through her duties with new purpose, her senses sharpened in ways she had never experienced before. She noticed things she might have overlooked entirely just a week earlier. The way Cale's personal attendant, a quiet young man named Martin, seemed increasingly anxious whenever anyone approached his quarters unannounced. The way messages arrived and departed from Cale's chambers at unusual hours, carried by servants who seemed uncertain of their purpose. The way Cale himself had begun glancing over his shoulder more frequently than his usual confident manner allowed. She reported each observation carefully to Nathan, who relayed everything directly to the king, and slowly, piece by piece, A clearer picture began to emerge of exactly how deep the betrayal ran, and how quickly it now threatened to unfold. Cale was not simply planning a distant future betrayal. He was actively accelerating his timeline, likely in direct response to the same subtle signs of suspicion he had noticed circling around him. Draven called a small, carefully selected group together late one night, meeting in a chamber deep beneath the castle rarely used except in times of genuine crisis. Nathan stood among them, along with Edward, whose decades of experience proved invaluable in weighing every option carefully, and Adam, whose recent scouting reports from the northern border had confirmed increased activity among the very packs Cale had been secretly corresponding with. "We cannot simply arrest him," Edward cautioned, his weathered voice carrying the weight of years spent navigating exactly these kinds of dangerous political situations. "If we move too soon, without proof strong enough to satisfy the council, we risk creating exactly the kind of division within the kingdom that our enemies hope to exploit. We need him caught clearly, undeniably, in the act itself." Nathan shifted uneasily where he stood near the chamber's stone wall, his arms crossed as he considered the practical dimension of what Edward proposed. "Even if we catch him in the act," he said, "we must consider carefully how word of this spreads afterward. Cale has trained half the guards in this castle personally. Many of the younger soldiers look to him as a mentor. If his betrayal becomes known too suddenly, without proper explanation, we risk sowing doubt and confusion among the very forces we will need to rely upon most in the moment the northern warriors actually arrive." "Then we prepare the explanation carefully, alongside the trap itself," Edward replied. "A clear account of events, ready to be shared the moment the confrontation concludes, leaving no room for rumor or misunderstanding to take root in the confusion that will inevitably follow." Adam, who had remained quiet through much of the discussion, spoke up with the practical concern of someone who had spent considerable time observing the physical realities of the northern border. "Timing will matter more than anything else," he said. "If we position our soldiers too early, before the ceremony draws sufficient attention elsewhere, sharp-eyed scouts among the northern warriors may notice unusual movement near the gate and call off the approach entirely, leaving us with confirmed suspicion but no clear proof to act upon. If we position them too late, we risk the northern warriors advancing further into the castle grounds than we can safely contain." Draven listened to each concern carefully, weighing the accumulated wisdom of advisors whose experience spanned decades of service to the kingdom in vastly different capacities. "Then we will need multiple contingencies," he said finally. "Not a single rigid plan that depends entirely on events unfolding exactly as we predict. Nathan, you will oversee the positioning of soldiers with flexibility built into their instructions, ready to adjust based on exactly how the northern warriors approach the gate. Edward, prepare the formal explanation we will need to share with the wider council and household, but hold it ready rather than final, in case circumstances require adjustment to the narrative once events actually conclude. Adam, continue your observation of the northern border right up until the ceremony itself, providing whatever final details might help us refine our timing in these last remaining days." Each member of the small circle nodded their understanding, the weight of the responsibility before them settling visibly over the chamber, despite the confident, decisive tone Draven had adopted throughout the discussion. It was Edward who finally voiced the concern that lingered beneath everyone's careful planning, the question none of them had yet dared to ask directly. "And if Cale discovers our preparation before the ceremony arrives?" Edward asked quietly. "What then? What if he abandons the plan entirely, or worse, moves against us directly rather than waiting for his northern allies to arrive?" Draven considered this question for a long moment before answering, his expression carrying the particular gravity of a king forced to plan for outcomes he desperately hoped to avoid. "Then we adapt," he said simply. "We have already discovered his betrayal through means he does not yet suspect. Whatever path he chooses if he senses discovery, we will meet it with whatever resources and preparation we have available in that moment. I would rather face an imperfect confrontation with full knowledge of the danger before us than remain ignorant and unprepared for whatever he might otherwise have accomplished." This answer seemed to satisfy the gathered advisors, though a current of tension remained beneath the chamber's quiet resolve as each of them turned to the specific tasks now assigned to them. The following days would require precision, discretion, and a level of coordinated trust that would test every relationship within Draven's inner circle, but none of them doubted the necessity of the path they had chosen, however uncertain its ultimate outcome remained. Draven nodded slowly, though frustration flickered briefly across his expression. Every instinct urged him toward immediate action, toward confronting the betrayal directly and ending the danger before it could grow any further. Yet he understood the wisdom in Edward's caution. A king who acted on suspicion alone, however well-founded, risked undermining the very trust and stability he needed to hold his kingdom together. Then we let him believe he has succeeded, Draven said finally, an idea beginning to take clearer shape in his mind. We allow his plan to unfold exactly as he intends, right up until the final moment, and we ensure that when the gates supposedly open at his signal, it is not our downfall waiting on the other side, but our victory. The room fell silent as the weight of this plan settled over each of them. It was a dangerous gamble, one that required precise timing and absolute secrecy, with very little room for error. If anything went wrong, if Kale discovered the deception even a moment too soon, the consequences could prove disastrous, not only for Draven personally but for the entire kingdom he had sworn to protect. Yet it was, Draven knew, the only path that offered a true resolution rather than a temporary reprieve. Simply removing Kale now would leave his northern allies still lurking beyond the border, still hungry for the opportunity his betrayal had promised them, still ready to strike again the moment another weakness presented itself. Only by allowing the full plan to unfold, and turning it back against those who had designed it, could Draven hope to end the threat completely. As the meeting drew to a close, and each member of the small circle departed to begin their assigned preparations, Draven remained behind in the quiet chamber, staring at the flickering torchlight along the stone walls. Somewhere above him, in the ordinary rhythm of castle life, Kale continued moving through his days believing his secret remained safely hidden, unaware that every step of his careful plan had already been anticipated, unaware that the king he intended to betray had already begun turning the very shadows Kale relied upon into a trap of his own design. The days that followed carried a strange, uneasy quality, as though the entire castle held its breath without quite understanding why. Life continued outwardly as it always had. Meals were served, guards rotated through their posts, merchants arrived at the gates with carts of grain and cloth, and the ordinary business of running a kingdom carried on beneath a surface that now concealed far more than anyone outside the small circle around Draven could possibly imagine. Illyra found herself living two lives at once. During the day, she remained the same quiet, unremarkable maid she had always been, scrubbing floors, carrying linens, serving meals with the same careful efficiency she had practiced for years. But beneath that familiar routine, she had become something else entirely, a quiet observer moving through the castle with sharpened senses, cataloging every small detail that might matter to the king and his closest advisors. She grew close, in these strange days, to a young stable hand named Daniel, who tended the horses in the eastern courtyard, and often crossed paths with her during her errands between the kitchens and the laundry. Daniel had no idea of the danger unfolding around them, and Illyra was careful to keep it that way, yet his easy friendship offered her a small measure of normalcy in days that otherwise felt anything but normal. He would tell her small stories about the horses, about a particularly stubborn mare that refused to be saddled without a proper argument first, and for a few brief moments each day, Illyra could almost forget the weight pressing down on her shoulders. But the weight always returned. She thought constantly of Kale, moving through the castle with his easy confidence, unaware that every eye that mattered now watched him carefully. She thought of Martin, his personal attendant, whose growing anxiety had become impossible to ignore even for someone as untrained in such observation as Illyra had once been. And she thought, most of all, of the northern packs waiting somewhere beyond the border, counting down the days until the moon rose full and the gates supposedly opened to deliver the kingdom into their hands. Nathan, meanwhile, had begun the delicate work of preparing the castle's defenses, without revealing the true purpose behind his preparations. He reorganized certain guard rotations under the guise of routine seasonal adjustments, quietly positioned additional soldiers near the northern gate under the pretense of increased border patrols, and ensured that key structural points throughout the outer walls received subtle reinforcement that would go unnoticed by anyone not specifically looking for it. Edward, for his part, focused his efforts on the delicate political dimension of the unfolding crisis. He understood, perhaps better than anyone else in the castle, that even a fully justified move against Kale could create dangerous ripples throughout the kingdom, if handled poorly. Kale was widely respected among the nobility and the common people alike, his reputation built over decades of loyal service. If his betrayal became public knowledge without careful handling, it risked shaking the confidence the people held not only in Kale himself, but in the stability of the kingdom's leadership as a whole. "We will need a clear and undeniable account of events," Edward told Draven during one of their private conversations. "Not simply for the council, but for the people themselves. They will need to understand exactly what happened and why, or rumor and fear will fill whatever gaps we leave behind." Draven understood this well enough, though the political dimension of the crisis weighed on him less heavily than the personal betrayal at its center. He found himself, in quiet moments alone, returning again and again to memories of Cale from their younger years, moments of genuine friendship and loyalty that made the current situation feel almost impossible to reconcile with the man he thought he knew. He wondered, more than once, what had changed, what resentment or ambition had grown quietly beneath the surface of a friendship he had believed unshakable. He did not yet have answers to these questions, and he suspected he would not find them until the full truth came to light, whenever and however that moment finally arrived. For now, he focused on the practical matters before him, the careful preparations required to ensure that when Cale's plan finally unfolded, it would collapse entirely upon itself, rather than achieving even a fraction of its intended destruction. A near disaster nearly undid all of their careful preparation just 2 days before Adam's return. Elira, hoping to gather further insight into Cale's plans, had taken to lingering near the armory corridor during quiet hours, the same location where she had first overheard his conversation with the northern stranger. She told herself she was simply being thorough, gathering whatever additional detail might prove useful to Draven and Nathan, though in truth she understood the risk of returning to that exact location carried a danger she could not fully justify through simple practicality alone. On this particular evening, she found herself frozen once more behind the same stone pillar, having heard Cale's voice drifting from the alcove just as it had weeks earlier. This time, however, he was not alone with a stranger from beyond the border. Martin stood beside him, and their conversation carried a sharper edge of urgency than she had witnessed before. "Someone has been asking questions," Martin was saying, his voice tight with obvious anxiety. "About your movements, about mine. I do not know who, but the pattern feels deliberate rather than coincidental." Cale's response carried a coldness that sent a fresh chill through Elira's chest. "If someone within this castle suspects anything, we will need to identify them quickly. Watch everyone closely, Martin. Servants especially. They move through every corner of this castle unnoticed, and unnoticed people make the most dangerous witnesses." Elira felt her blood run cold at these words, understanding with sudden clarity that Cale's suspicion had grown far closer to the truth than she had previously realized. She began to retreat carefully from her position behind the pillar, moving with painstaking slowness to avoid any sound that might betray her presence, when her foot caught against a loose stone in the corridor floor, sending a small clatter echoing through the quiet passage. The conversation in the alcove stopped instantly. Elira's heart seized with pure terror as she heard footsteps approaching, and she had only seconds to decide whether to flee, risking discovery through obvious flight, or to remain still and hope the shadows concealed her fully. She chose stillness, pressing herself as flat as possible against the cold stone wall, praying desperately that whoever approached would not think to look directly behind the pillar. Martin appeared first, his eyes scanning the dim corridor with obvious suspicion, and for one agonizing moment, Elira was certain he would find her, that everything she had worked toward these past weeks would collapse in this single instant of carelessness. But a distant sound elsewhere in the castle, perhaps a servant's footsteps in another corridor entirely, drew his attention away, and after a tense pause that felt to Elira like an eternity, he turned and returned to the alcove, muttering something about rats or drafts causing the noise. Elira remained frozen against the wall for several long minutes after the voices resumed their quiet conversation, her entire body trembling with the aftermath of pure terror, before she finally found the courage to slip away entirely, moving through the shadows with a caution that left her exhausted by the time she reached the safety of her own quarters. She did not sleep at all that night, replaying the near discovery over and over in her mind, understanding now with absolute certainty exactly how close she had come to exposing not only herself, but the entire careful plan Draven and his advisors had worked so hard to construct. She reported the encounter to Nathan first thing the following morning, her voice still carrying traces of the fear that had gripped her through the long, sleepless night. Nathan listened with visible alarm, immediately recognizing the gravity of what she had witnessed and how close disaster had truly come to unraveling everything. "You must not return to that corridor again under any circumstance," he said firmly, his usual calm composure replaced by genuine urgency. "Whatever additional information you believe yourself capable of gathering, the risk has grown too great to justify it further. Cale already suspects that someone within the castle has grown too curious about his movements. We cannot afford to confirm that suspicion by allowing you to be discovered." Elira, chastened by how narrowly she had avoided disaster, agreed without argument this time, understanding fully the wisdom in Nathan's caution. She relayed the exact substance of the overheard conversation to Draven later that same day, watching his expression grow increasingly grave as he absorbed the confirmation that Cale's suspicion had grown sharp enough to specifically target the castle's servants as potential witnesses to his betrayal. "We must move more carefully than ever now," Draven said, and we must ensure that whatever preparations remain are completed with absolute discretion. If Kale begins actively searching for whoever has been observing him, the danger to you personally grows considerably greater than it has been until this point. It was this exact conversation that ultimately led to Nathan's decision, mentioned only briefly amid the flurry of preparations that followed, to arrange quiet protection around Alira's movements throughout the castle, without her full awareness of the extent of it, a precaution that would prove its worth just days later, when Martin's suspicion turned directly toward her during their tense encounter near the linen storeroom. Adam returned from his scouting mission along the northern border 4 days after his initial departure, bringing with him detailed reports that confirmed the growing urgency of the situation. The northern packs, he reported, had begun gathering in greater numbers than usual near the border territories, their movements careful and deliberate in a manner that suggested organized preparation rather than routine patrol activity. He had observed from a careful distance what appeared to be supplies being stockpiled at several locations, along with an unusual concentration of warriors positioned within striking distance of the kingdom's outer territories. "They are ready to move," Adam reported grimly during a private meeting with Draven and Nathan. "Whatever signal they are waiting for, I do not believe they intend to wait much longer once it arrives." This news added fresh urgency to their preparations. Draven understood now that whatever plan he intended to set in motion needed to unfold soon, before Kale's northern allies grew impatient enough to act without waiting for the promised signal at all. Every day of delay increased the risk that something might go wrong, that the careful trap he intended to spring might collapse before it ever had the chance to close around those who deserved to be caught within it. That evening, as the castle settled into its usual nighttime quiet, Alira noticed something that immediately struck her as significant. Martin, Kale's personal attendant, left the castle grounds entirely under cover of darkness, moving with obvious care to avoid the notice of the guards stationed at the smaller side gates rarely used after sunset. Alira happened to be returning from the well behind the kitchens at exactly the moment Martin slipped through the shadows near the stable yard, and something about his furtive movement immediately caught her attention. She did not follow him, understanding the danger such an action would carry, but she made careful note of the direction he traveled and the hour of his departure, information she relayed to Nathan the following morning, with as much precision as she could recall. Nathan listened carefully, his expression growing increasingly serious as she described what she had witnessed. "That confirms what we suspected," he told her quietly. "Kale is using his attendant to carry messages he no longer trusts to send through the usual channels. If Martin traveled toward the northern border, it likely means Kale is finalizing details directly with his contacts rather than relying on written correspondence that might be intercepted." This information proved crucial in the days that followed, allowing Draven and his small circle of trusted allies to refine their understanding of exactly how and when Kale's plan intended to unfold. Through careful observation, through the quiet courage of a maid who continued to notice what others overlooked, and through the diligent work of scouts and soldiers moving unseen through the shadows of both the castle and the surrounding territories, the true shape of the betrayal finally began to emerge with startling clarity. The northern packs intended to move on the night of the full moon, now less than a week away, using the cover of the traditional gathering ceremony that would draw much of the castle's attention toward the Great Hall and away from the outer walls. Kale would ensure the northern gate remained lightly guarded during the ceremony, using his authority as beta to reassign the usual guard rotation under some plausible pretext. When the moon reached its highest point, the gates would open, and the northern warriors would flood into the castle grounds before anyone realized what had happened. It was, Draven had to admit, a carefully constructed plan, one that relied heavily on the trust and authority Kale had earned over decades of loyal service. Had Alira not overheard that fateful conversation in the corridor near the armory, had she not found the courage to risk everything by slipping her warning into the king's hand, the plan might well have succeeded exactly as intended, leaving the kingdom vulnerable to devastation before anyone understood the true danger closing in around them. But now, armed with this knowledge, Draven found himself facing a different kind of challenge entirely. He needed to prepare his own counter to Kale's plan with equal precision, ensuring that when the northern warriors finally crossed through those gates, they would find not the easy victory they expected, but a carefully prepared trap waiting to close around them completely. With the shape of Kale's plan now clear, Draven turned his attention to the delicate work of building a counter to it, one that would require the cooperation of nearly every trusted soldier and advisor within his inner circle, all while maintaining absolute secrecy from everyone else within the castle walls. He gathered Nathan, Edward, and Adam once more in the hidden chamber beneath the castle, along with a handful of additional officers whose loyalty had never once wavered throughout years of service. "We allow the ceremony to proceed exactly as Kale expects," Draven explained, spreading a detailed map of the castle grounds across the stone table before them. The northern gate will appear lightly guarded, precisely as his plan requires. But the soldiers stationed there will not be the ordinary rotation Kale anticipates. They will be hand-picked, positioned in ways that remain invisible from any casual observation, ready to close the trap the moment the northern warriors cross through. Nathan studied the map carefully, his finger tracing the path from the northern gate toward the inner courtyard. The real danger, he said slowly, lies in the ceremony itself. If Kale suspects even for a moment that something has changed, he may abandon the plan entirely, or worse, warn his allies before we have the chance to close the trap around them. Then we ensure he suspects nothing, Draven replied firmly. Everything continues exactly as it always has. I will attend the ceremony as I always do. You will maintain your usual duties. Kale must believe, right up until the final moment, that his plan remains entirely hidden from us. This meant, Draven understood, that he would need to continue treating Kale with the same easy familiarity he always had, sharing meals, discussing matters of state, offering the same trust and respect that had defined their relationship for over 20 years, all while knowing the full truth of the betrayal Kale had planned against him. It was, perhaps, the most difficult part of the entire plan, requiring a level of restraint and performance that tested Draven in ways few challenges ever had. The following days passed with agonizing slowness for everyone involved in the secret preparation. Illyra continued her careful observations, noting each small detail that might prove useful, while trying desperately to maintain her ordinary routine well enough that no one, especially Kale or his attendant Martin, grew suspicious of any change in her behavior. She found herself growing closer, almost unwillingly, to the strange new reality of her double life. A servant girl who spent her days scrubbing floors and her quiet moments gathering information that might determine the fate of an entire kingdom. Grace noticed her continued distraction, though Illyra managed to deflect most of her friends' concerned questions with vague explanations about exhaustion and worry over an ailing relative in the lower village, a small lie she disliked telling but understood as necessary for Grace's own protection. Still, the weight of carrying such an enormous secret alone grew heavier with each passing day, and Illyra found herself increasingly grateful for the brief, quiet moments she spent in Draven's private study, sharing information and receiving, in return, a strange kind of validation she had not expected to find in her position. During one such meeting, 3 days before the full moon ceremony, Draven found himself studying Illyra with a curiosity that extended beyond simply the information she carried. "You have shown remarkable courage throughout all of this," he said quietly, setting aside the reports Nathan had prepared for their review. "Most people, faced with what you overheard, would have said nothing at all, choosing the safety of silence over the risk of involvement." Illyra considered his words carefully before responding. "I have spent most of my life being unseen," she said finally. "It seemed strange at first, to imagine that something I noticed, something I did, might actually matter to anyone, but I could not make myself believe that silence would have been the right choice, no matter how much safer it might have felt." Draven nodded slowly, something thoughtful passing behind his eyes. "The kingdom owes you a debt it does not yet know it carries," he said. "When this is finished, that debt will not go unrecognized, whatever form recognition may need to take." Illyra felt a flush of unexpected warmth at these words, quickly followed by a flicker of uncertainty about what exactly such recognition might mean for someone in her position. She said nothing further on the matter, understanding that the more immediate concerns before them mattered far more than uncertain rewards that might or might not materialize once the crisis had passed. Amid the mounting tension of those final days before the ceremony, Illyra found unexpected comfort in her friendship with Daniel, the stable hand who remained entirely unaware of the danger unfolding around the castle. One afternoon, while she carried a bundle of freshly laundered blankets toward the stables to help prepare bedding for the horses ahead of the coming cold nights, she found him brushing down the same stubborn mare he often complained about, his easy laughter offering a welcome distraction from the weight she carried everywhere else. "You seem troubled again," Daniel observed, glancing up from his work with genuine concern. "You have carried that same look for weeks now. Whatever it is, I hope it resolves itself soon, for your sake." "It will resolve soon enough," Illyra replied, offering him a tired but genuine smile. "I cannot say more than that, but soon, this will all be behind us, one way or another." Daniel studied her for a moment, clearly sensing that something significant lay beneath her careful words, but he had known her long enough to understand that she would share what she could when circumstances allowed it, and he respected that boundary without pressing further. "Whatever it is," he said instead, "know that not everyone in this castle has forgotten how to notice you, even if you have spent most of your years here feeling invisible. Some of us have always seen you clearly enough." His words stayed with her throughout the following days, a small, steady reminder that her worth had never truly depended on whether powerful people within the castle chose to notice her, a truth she was only now beginning to fully believe about herself even as her circumstances shifted so dramatically around her. Draven, too, found himself increasingly occupied by thoughts that extended beyond the immediate crisis at hand. During a rare, quiet evening before the final preparations began in earnest, he found himself walking the castle's outer gardens alone, turning over in his mind not only the practical challenges of the coming confrontation, but also the strange, unexpected shift in his own feelings that had begun taking root over the preceding weeks. He had known, in the abstract sense that any king understood intellectually, that courage could exist in any person regardless of their station. But knowing this as a general principle and witnessing it so vividly embodied in one specific person had changed something fundamental in how he viewed the rigid boundaries that had always defined castle life. Allura had risked everything with nothing to gain, motivated by nothing beyond a simple, unshakable conviction that silence in the face of wrong would have made her complicit in whatever followed. He found himself, during these quiet moments of reflection, questioning assumptions he had carried for most of his life, about the natural order separating nobility from those who served them. It was not that he believed titles and stations meant nothing, understanding as he did the practical necessity of structure and hierarchy in governing a kingdom successfully. But he had begun to understand, with a clarity that felt almost uncomfortable in its implications, that true character often revealed itself most clearly in people the world had trained itself not to notice at all. These thoughts remained largely private during those tense final days, subordinate to the practical urgency of preparing for whatever the ceremony night might bring. But they lingered nonetheless, quietly shaping how he would come to view Allura in the weeks that followed the crisis, long after the immediate danger of Cale's betrayal had finally been resolved. Meanwhile, Cale's own preparations continued apace. Entirely unaware of the counter forming quietly around him, he met with the northern contact one final time under cover of darkness, confirming the details of the ceremony night and the precise timing required for the gates to open at the moon's highest point. The northern leader, a sharp-eyed woman named Claire who commanded considerable respect among the border packs, pressed him for absolute assurance that nothing had changed within the castle that might complicate their arrangement. "Nothing has changed," Cale assured her, though a faint unease still lingered in the back of his mind, the lingering suspicion he could not quite shake, despite finding no concrete evidence to support it. "The king suspects nothing. The gate will be exactly as light as we discussed, and my position ensures that no one questions the arrangement." Claire studied him with the careful scrutiny of someone accustomed to weighing the reliability of every promise made to her. "Your position has served us well thus far," she said finally. "See that it continues to do so until the moment our warriors cross that threshold. We have waited a long time for this opportunity, and we do not intend to let it slip away through carelessness." Cale assured her once more that everything remained precisely as planned, and the two parted ways beneath the cover of the forest darkness, each believing they understood exactly how the coming days would unfold. Neither of them yet grasped how thoroughly their careful arrangement had already been anticipated, how completely the trap they believed they were setting had instead become the very mechanism of their own undoing. Back within the castle walls, the final preparations continued with meticulous care. Nathan personally selected the soldiers who would occupy the northern gate during the ceremony, choosing only those whose loyalty he trusted absolutely, and whose combat experience made them capable of executing the plan without hesitation once the moment arrived. Edward drafted careful language for the announcement that would eventually need to be made to the wider council and the kingdom's people, ensuring that whatever unfolded during the ceremony would be understood clearly and without the confusion that unclear communication might otherwise create. Draven, for his part, found himself increasingly focused on the personal dimension of the coming confrontation, the moment when he would finally need to face Cale directly and confront the full weight of the betrayal that had grown quietly between them. He rehearsed, in quiet moments alone, exactly what he might say, though every version of the conversation felt inadequate to capture the complicated mixture of anger, grief, and disbelief that churned within him whenever he allowed himself to fully consider what his oldest friend had done. He thought, too, about the reasons behind Cale's betrayal, a question that troubled him almost as much as the betrayal itself. Cale had never lacked for position, wealth, or respect within the kingdom. His loyalty had always seemed unshakable, forged through decades of shared hardship and triumph. What resentment, what ambition, what hidden grievance could have grown strong enough to turn such loyalty into betrayal so complete that it risked delivering an entire kingdom into the hands of its enemies? These questions remained unanswered as the days counted down toward the full moon ceremony, each hour bringing the kingdom closer to a confrontation that would finally reveal not only the truth of Kale's betrayal, but the full measure of everyone involved in either preventing or enabling it. Alira continued her quiet vigilance. Nathan finalized his careful arrangement of soldiers throughout the castle grounds, and Draven prepared himself, as best he could, for a moment he had never wanted to face but now understood was entirely unavoidable. 2 nights before the ceremony, Alira found herself facing a danger she had not anticipated. She had finished her evening duties later than usual, and was making her way back toward the servants' quarters through a narrow corridor, rarely used after dark, when she noticed Martin standing near the entrance to the linen storeroom, his posture tense and his eyes fixed directly on her in a manner that immediately set her nerves on edge. "You have been asking a great many questions lately," Martin said quietly, stepping forward so that the flickering torchlight caught the wary suspicion in his expression. "About my comings and goings, about matters that should not concern a servant whose duties involve nothing beyond the kitchens and the laundry." Alira felt her pulse quicken, though she forced herself to keep her expression neutral, drawing on the same composure that had carried her through her first terrifying encounter with the king weeks earlier. "I do not know what you mean," she said evenly. "I have simply gone about my usual duties." "Have you?" Martin said, his voice carrying an edge that had not been there in their previous, entirely ordinary interactions. "Because it seems to me that your usual duties have taken you past my quarters rather more frequently than they once did, and always at hours when you would have little reason to be there otherwise." For a moment, Alira feared she had been discovered entirely, that her careful observations over the preceding weeks had somehow reached Martin's notice and, through him, might soon reach Kale as well. She thought quickly, drawing on instincts she had not known she possessed before this entire ordeal began. "I have been worried about my friend Grace," she said, choosing to lie carefully. "She mentioned once that you had shown her some kindness, and I wished to know whether I might trust you as someone who could look out for her, given how few people in this castle bother to notice servants at all." It was a thin explanation, and she was not entirely certain Martin believed it, but something in his expression shifted slightly, the sharp suspicion softening into something closer to uncertain wariness. "Grace has never mentioned any particular concern to me," he said slowly. "But if that is truly your worry, you need not trouble yourself further. I have no unkind intentions toward anyone in this castle." He stepped aside then, allowing her to pass, though his eyes followed her carefully as she continued down the corridor, her heart still pounding long after she had turned the corner and put distance between herself and his suspicious gaze. She reported the encounter to Nathan the following morning, her voice still carrying traces of the fear that had gripped her during the confrontation. Nathan listened with grave attention, understanding immediately the danger such an encounter represented. "If Martin suspects you specifically, he may report that suspicion directly to Kale, and Kale may then wonder whether his plans have been compromised through more than simple bad fortune," he said. "You must be far more careful in the coming days. I will arrange for someone to watch over your movements, quietly, without drawing attention, to ensure your safety until this entire matter reaches its conclusion." Draven, upon hearing of the encounter later that same day, felt a fresh surge of protective concern that surprised him with its intensity. He had grown accustomed, over the preceding weeks, to valuing Alira's contributions to uncovering the full scope of Kale's betrayal, but the thought of her facing direct danger because of the very courage that had made those contributions possible troubled him more deeply than he had expected. "You should withdraw from any further direct observation," he told her firmly during their next private meeting. "You have already given this kingdom more than anyone could reasonably ask. I will not risk your safety further when we already possess enough information to proceed with our plan." Alira, however, found herself unwilling to simply step back now that the crisis approached its most critical moment. "If I withdraw suddenly, without explanation, it may draw exactly the kind of suspicion we are trying to avoid," she argued. "Better that I continue my ordinary duties exactly as I always have, giving Martin no further reason to wonder about my behavior, while allowing your soldiers to handle whatever unfolds at the gate itself. I do not need to place myself in further danger to remain useful. I simply need to remain visible and unremarkable, precisely as I have always been." Draven studied her for a long moment, torn between his instinct to shield her from any further risk, and his recognition that her judgment about how to navigate the delicate final days before the ceremony was, in truth, sounder than his own protective impulse. Eventually he nodded, though reluctance remained evident in his expression. "Be careful," he said quietly. "Whatever happens in the days ahead, I find that I have come to value your safety as much as the safety of this kingdom itself." The morning of the ceremony arrived beneath a sky heavy with gray clouds. the kind of stillness in the air that seemed to hold its breath along with everyone who understood what the coming night would bring. Elira woke earlier than usual, her stomach tight with a nervous energy she could not entirely calm no matter how many times she reminded herself that the careful preparations of the past week had accounted for nearly every possibility. She moved through her morning duties with mechanical precision, her mind elsewhere entirely, and twice she caught herself staring blankly at a task she had already completed, her thoughts drifting toward the northern gate and the soldiers who would soon take their hidden positions there. Grace noticed her distraction once more but said nothing this time, perhaps sensing that whatever troubled her friend went far deeper than simple exhaustion, though she still had no idea of the true danger unfolding around them. Cale, too, moved through his morning with an outward calm that concealed considerable inner tension. He met with Draven as he always did, reviewing the final arrangements for the evening ceremony, discussing which nobles would attend and which matters of state might require brief attention before the festivities began in earnest. Draven maintained his usual easy manner throughout their conversation, offering the same warmth and familiarity that had always characterized their friendship, and if Cale noticed anything unusual in his king's behavior, he gave no outward sign of it. The northern watch rotation, Cale mentioned near the end of their meeting, his tone carefully casual. I thought it might be wise to lighten the guard there tonight. The ceremony draws most of the household's attention regardless, and there seems little reason to waste soldiers standing watch over an empty stretch of wall when they might better serve elsewhere during the festivities. Draven considered this for a moment, careful to let just enough hesitation show to seem natural, before nodding in apparent agreement. A reasonable suggestion, he said. See to it as you think best. Inside, Draven felt something twist painfully at how easily Cale delivered this final piece of his betrayal, dressing the opening of the kingdom's gates in the reasonable, practical language of routine administration. It confirmed, with a clarity that stung more than he expected, exactly how far his old friend had traveled from the loyalty they had once shared without question. As the day wore on, the castle began its preparations for the evening ceremony in earnest. Servants decorated the great hall with careful attention to tradition, hanging banners that celebrated the full moon's significance to the pack, arranging tables laden with food that would sustain the celebration long into the night. Musicians tuned their instruments in a corner of the hall, and the general atmosphere throughout the castle carried the particular electric excitement that always accompanied such gatherings. Beneath this visible celebration, however, a far more serious operation continued to unfold. Nathan moved quietly among his selected soldiers throughout the afternoon, giving each of them final instructions for the positions they would need to occupy once darkness fell, and the ceremony drew the household's attention toward the great hall. Every soldier understood the stakes involved, the absolute necessity of remaining hidden and silent until the precise moment their king's signal called them into action. Adam, meanwhile, had positioned himself at a discreet vantage point overlooking the approach to the northern gate from beyond the castle walls, watching for any sign of the northern warriors' advance that might indicate their timing had shifted from what Cale had promised his allies. He remained there throughout the afternoon and into early evening, his patience unwavering despite the growing tension that had settled over every aspect of the day's preparations. As evening approached, Elira found herself once more summoned to Draven's private study, this time for what both of them understood might be their final conversation before the events of the night unfolded in whatever direction fate intended. She arrived to find the king standing near the window, watching the last light of day fade from the sky, his expression carrying a weight she had not seen from him before. "Tonight decides everything," he said quietly, without turning from the window. "If our preparations hold, if every piece falls exactly as we have arranged it, the threat against this kingdom ends before it truly begins. If something goes wrong, if Cale or his allies sense the trap before it closes around them, the consequences may prove far more severe than any of us wish to consider." Elira remained silent for a moment, understanding that he was not truly seeking a response but rather giving voice to the weight he carried alone, despite the careful preparations of the past week. "You have done everything within your power," she said finally. "Whatever happens tonight, that much remains true." Draven turned to look at her then, something almost grateful passing across his expression. "You gave me the chance to do anything at all," he said. "Without your courage that night, none of this preparation would exist. Whatever happens tonight, know that the kingdom's survival, whatever form it takes, will owe itself to you, as much as to anyone within these walls." Elira felt an unexpected warmth rise in her chest at these words, though she pushed the feeling aside quickly, understanding that the night ahead demanded her full attention rather than any distraction, however welcome it might feel. "What would you have me do tonight?" she asked, "while everything unfolds?" "Remain visible," Draven instructed her. Continue your duties exactly as you always would during such a ceremony. If anyone were to notice your absence or any change in your usual behavior, it might raise questions we cannot afford tonight of all nights. Trust that Nathan and his soldiers will handle whatever comes through that gate. Your role, for tonight, is simply to remain exactly who you have always appeared to be." Elira nodded, understanding the wisdom in this instruction even as a part of her wished she could do more than simply carry trays and pour wine, while the fate of the kingdom hung in the balance elsewhere. But she trusted Draven's judgment, and she returned to her duties as the great hall began filling with nobles and household members eager for the evening's festivities. The ceremony began exactly as tradition dictated, with Draven presiding over the opening rites from his place at the high table, offering the traditional words that honored the full moon's significance to the pack's history and strength. Kale stood near his usual position close to the king, his expression carrying the same easy confidence he always displayed during such occasions, giving no outward indication of the tension that surely churned beneath his composed exterior. As the evening progressed, the hall filled with music and laughter, the warmth of celebration spreading through the gathered household in the way it always did during such traditional gatherings. Elira moved through the crowd with her usual careful efficiency, refilling cups and clearing plates, though her attention remained sharply focused on any small detail that might signal trouble brewing beneath the celebration's surface. At one point during the evening, Martin approached the serving table where Elira stood, his eyes lingering on her a moment longer than felt entirely comfortable given their tense encounter near the linen storeroom just days earlier. She kept her expression carefully neutral, offering him a simple, unremarkable nod of acknowledgement before turning her attention to refilling a nearby noble's goblet, her heart pounding beneath her calm exterior despite her outward composure. "You seem well tonight," Martin said, his tone carrying an edge she could not quite decipher, whether genuine suspicion or simple idle conversation born from the festive atmosphere surrounding them both. "As well as any evening allows," Elira replied evenly, forcing a small smile. "The ceremony always brings a certain energy to the household, does it not?" Martin studied her a moment longer before something in his posture eased slightly, and he moved on toward another section of the hall without further comment. Elira released a slow, careful breath once his attention had shifted elsewhere, grateful that Nathan's quiet protective measures, whatever specific form they had taken, seemed to have kept her safe from whatever deeper suspicion Martin might otherwise have pursued that evening. She caught Nathan's eye briefly from across the hall, and he offered the smallest, most subtle nod of acknowledgement, a silent confirmation that everything remained proceeding according to their careful plan despite the tension of the moment. Elira returned to her duties with renewed focus, understanding that whatever fear still lingered within her, the coming hours would demand every measure of composure she could manage to maintain. Outside, beyond the castle walls, the northern warriors began their careful approach through the darkening forest, moving with the practiced silence of experienced fighters who had planned this moment for months. Claire led them personally, her sharp eyes scanning the shadows for any sign that their arrangement with Kale had been compromised, though she found nothing to suggest anything had changed from what had been promised to her. At the northern gate, the small handful of soldiers Kale had arranged to leave on watch stood in their positions, appearing entirely ordinary to any casual observation, giving no hint of the additional soldiers Nathan had carefully hidden within the shadows of the nearby watchtower and along the inner wall just beyond the gate itself. Everything appeared exactly as Kale had promised his allies it would, an unremarkable night, with only token resistance standing between the northern warriors and the castle they intended to claim. As the moon rose steadily higher in the night sky, visible through the tall windows of the great hall, tension continued building beneath the celebration's outward warmth. Draven found himself watching the moon's progress with careful attention, understanding that its highest point would mark the moment everything he had prepared for finally came to fruition, one way or another. Beside him, though he gave no outward sign of it, Kale too watched the moon's progress, his own tension mounting as the appointed hour drew steadily closer. Neither man spoke of what they each understood was coming. They continued their easy conversation, their shared laughter over old memories and current matters of state, maintaining the careful performance that had defined their interactions throughout the entire preceding week. But beneath that performance, both of them understood that the moment of truth approached with each passing minute, and neither could fully predict exactly how the night would ultimately unfold once that moment finally arrived. The moon climbed higher above the castle, its pale light spilling through the tall windows of the great hall and painting long silver shapes across the stone floor. Elira felt the tension in the air thicken with every passing moment, though the celebration around her continued undisturbed, nobles laughing over cups of wine, musicians weaving melodies through the crowded hall, servants moving back and forth with practiced ease. To anyone unaware of what truly waited beyond the walls, the evening appeared exactly as any full moon ceremony always had. Near the northern gate, Adam remained perfectly still in his hidden position, watching the tree line beyond the wall with unwavering focus. The first sign came not as noise but as movement, a subtle shifting of shadows among the distant trees that would have meant nothing to an untrained eye, but told Adam everything he needed to know. He raised a small signal light, shielded carefully from view except toward the watchtower where Nathan's soldiers waited, and within moments, the silent message passed along the chain of hidden positions Nathan had arranged throughout the afternoon. The northern warriors emerged from the tree line in careful, disciplined formation, moving swiftly across the open ground toward the gate that Cale had promised would offer no meaningful resistance. Claire led them at the front, her eyes fixed on the seemingly unguarded entrance, confidence radiating from her posture as she anticipated an easy, decisive victory that had been months in the planning. They reached the gate without incident, and for one brief, suspended moment, everything appeared to be unfolding exactly as promised. The gate stood open, just as arranged, with only the small handful of visible guards standing at their posts, offering no resistance as the northern warriors began pouring through the entrance and into the outer courtyard beyond. Then, without warning, the shadows along the inner wall came alive. Nathan's hidden soldiers emerged from their concealed positions with swift, coordinated precision, surrounding the northern warriors before they had fully processed what was happening. Torches flared to life along the wall, illuminating the courtyard in sudden brightness that revealed the true scale of the force waiting for them, far greater than anything the visible guard rotation had suggested. Confusion rippled through the northern ranks as they realized, all at once, that the easy victory they had anticipated had transformed instantly into a carefully constructed trap. Claire's confident expression shattered into something far more desperate as she took in the true situation surrounding her warriors. She shouted commands, attempting to rally her forces into some kind of coordinated response, but the surprise and the overwhelming numbers arrayed against them left little room for anything beyond confusion and scattered resistance. Within minutes, the northern warriors found themselves surrounded completely, their weapons lowered under the watchful eyes of soldiers who had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment. Inside the great hall, the celebration continued for a few moments longer, before the first signs of disturbance reached the gathered nobles. A guard entered quietly through a side door, moving directly toward Draven's position at the high table, and though he kept his voice low, something in his posture immediately caught the attention of those seated nearby, including Cale, whose easy expression flickered for just a moment with something that looked remarkably like dawning realization. Draven listened to the guard's brief report with a calm that belied the significance of what he was hearing, then rose from his seat, his expression shifting into something far more serious than the warm hospitality he had maintained throughout the evening. The music faltered as the musicians noticed the change in atmosphere, and gradually the entire hall fell into an uneasy silence, as every eye turned toward their king. "It seems," Draven said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet hall, "that we have uninvited guests attempting to join our celebration through the northern gate." Confusion rippled through the gathered nobles, murmurs of alarm spreading quickly as they tried to understand exactly what their king meant. Cale, standing near his usual position close to the high table, felt something cold settle in his chest as he began to understand, with dawning horror, that whatever he had believed remained hidden from Draven had clearly been discovered, and worse, had been turned back against him with devastating precision. Draven turned his gaze directly toward Cale then, and the weight of that look carried more than simple accusation. It carried the full grief of 20 years of friendship now shattered beyond any possibility of repair, the disbelief of discovering betrayal in the last place he had ever expected to find it, and the cold, controlled fury of a king who had been forced to prepare, in secret, against the very man who had once stood as his most trusted ally. "You should have chosen differently, old friend," Draven said quietly, though his voice carried clearly enough for those standing nearby to hear every word. "Whatever grievance you carried, whatever ambition drove you to this choice, you might have brought it to me directly. Instead, you chose to open our gates to those who wish nothing but our destruction." Cale's expression cycled rapidly through several emotions, shock giving way to something that looked almost like relief that the secret was finally exposed, followed quickly by a kind of desperate defiance that suggested he had already begun calculating whether any path remained for him beyond simple surrender. "You do not understand," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Everything I have done, everything I have sacrificed for this kingdom, and still, you passed me over when it mattered most. You gave the succession consideration to others while I stood beside you through every battle, every hardship, every moment when true loyalty actually mattered." The hall fell into stunned silence at this admission, nobles exchanging shocked glances as they began to grasp the full scope of what had apparently transpired beneath the surface of their kingdom's leadership. Draven's expression remained controlled, though something flickered behind his eyes that suggested Cale's words had struck somewhere deep and painful. "So this is what it comes to," Draven said slowly. 20 years of friendship, sacrificed because ambition could not accept patience. You would have delivered our people, our children, our entire way of life into the hands of those who have never once sought anything but our destruction, all because you believed yourself owed something beyond what you already possessed. "I believed myself owed recognition," Cale snapped back, his composure finally breaking entirely under the weight of exposure. "I believed myself owed the respect that loyalty should earn, not the quiet dismissal I received time and again, while others rose through positions I had earned through actual sacrifice." Before the confrontation could escalate further, Nathan appeared at the entrance to the Great Hall, his expression carrying the particular satisfaction of a soldier who had executed a difficult plan successfully. "The northern warriors have been contained," he announced clearly, his voice carrying easily through the tense silence of the hall. "Their leader has surrendered rather than risk further losses. The gate has been secured, and no harm has come to any of our people." A wave of relief swept visibly through the gathered nobles at this news, though the tension surrounding Cale's exposed betrayal remained thick in the air. Draven nodded once at Nathan's report, before turning his attention back toward Cale, whose posture had shifted from defiance into something closer to resignation, as he understood the full scope of his failure. "Take him," Draven said quietly, his voice carrying none of the warmth that had once characterized every interaction between them. "Secure him separately from the northern warriors. His fate will be decided properly, with full consideration of everything that led to this moment. But not tonight, and not in the middle of a hall filled with people who deserve to celebrate their kingdom's survival, rather than witness its former commander's disgrace." Guards moved forward to escort Cale from the hall, and though he offered no physical resistance, the look he cast back toward Draven carried a complicated mixture of shame, anger, and something that almost resembled grief for the friendship he had thrown away through his own choices. Draven held that gaze steadily until Cale disappeared through the hall's entrance, and only then did he allow himself a long, weary breath, the first real release of tension he had permitted himself throughout the entire careful ordeal. Across the hall, standing near the wall with a tray still held forgotten in her hands, Elira watched the entire confrontation unfold with a strange mixture of relief and lingering unease. The immediate danger had passed, the kingdom had survived the night exactly as Draven's careful planning had intended, but the deeper wounds of betrayal, the questions about loyalty and ambition and what drove people to abandon everything they once valued, remained far from fully resolved. The days following the failed betrayal passed in a strange, uneasy quiet. The kind that settles over a household after a great storm has finally passed, but before anyone has fully assessed the damage left behind. The northern warriors captured at the gate were held under careful guard in the lower chambers of the castle, awaiting a decision about their fate that would need to account for the delicate politics between the kingdom and the border territories they called home. Claire herself remained separated from her warriors, held in a private chamber where Edward visited her personally, seeking to understand the full scope of what had driven her people to risk such an open confrontation. "We have watched your kingdom grow stronger for years, while our own lands struggle against harsher seasons and thinner resources," Claire admitted during one such conversation, her earlier confidence replaced by the weary honesty of someone who understood her plan had failed completely. "When Cale first approached us with his offer, it seemed like an opportunity we could not afford to refuse, a chance to secure resources and territory that might finally ease the hardship our people have endured for generations." Edward listened carefully, recognizing in her words not simple malice, but genuine desperation, born from circumstances that had nothing to do with Cale's personal grievances against Draven. It complicated the situation considerably, suggesting that any lasting resolution would need to address not only the immediate crisis of Cale's betrayal, but the deeper tensions between the kingdom and its northern neighbors that had made such a betrayal possible in the first place. He relayed this information to Draven, who absorbed it with the same careful consideration he applied to every difficult decision that crossed his path. "Punishing her people alone will not resolve the underlying hunger that drove them toward this desperate gamble," Draven observed during a private council meeting held in the days following the confrontation. "If we wish to prevent future betrayals of this kind, we must consider addressing the circumstances that made betrayal seem preferable to patience in the first place." This realization shaped much of the kingdom's response in the weeks that followed. Rather than treating the northern warriors purely as enemies deserving harsh punishment, Draven proposed a careful negotiation that would return them to their territories alongside an offer of expanded trade agreements, resources shared more generously than the strained relationship between the territories had previously allowed. It was not a decision every noble within his council supported without reservation, and heated debate filled several council sessions before a workable arrangement finally took shape. During one of Edward's visits to the Northern Warriors' holding chambers, seeking further understanding of how deeply Cale's resentment had shaped his final betrayal, Claire offered an unexpected piece of the story that had not yet reached Draven's ears. She described a conversation Cale had shared with her during their earliest secret meetings, one that revealed the resentment had taken root far earlier than anyone within the castle had realized. He spoke of a summer many years ago, Claire recounted, when the previous council debated who among the king's closest companions should be granted formal recognition as heir apparent to the position of Beta, should anything ever befall the man who then held that role. Cale believed the position would naturally fall to him, given his service and his closeness with your king even then. Instead, the council granted the temporary honor to another candidate entirely, a decision reversed only when that candidate later proved unsuitable, and Cale finally received the position years afterward, but not before the wound of that initial rejection had settled somewhere deep within him. Edward relayed this account to Draven, who found himself recalling, with slowly dawning understanding, the very council session Claire had described, a decision made so long ago that he had genuinely forgotten how it might have affected Cale's sense of his own standing and worth. He remembered now, with a discomfort he had not expected, how Cale's demeanor had shifted subtly in the months following that decision, a shift he had attributed at the time to simple maturity, rather than recognizing it as the beginning of a resentment that would eventually grow into something far more dangerous. "I did not see it," Draven admitted to Edward during a quiet conversation in his study, the weight of this realization settling heavily upon him. "I was so certain of his loyalty, so confident that our friendship existed beyond the reach of such political disappointments, that I never once considered how deeply that early rejection might have wounded him." "No one sees every wound that festers beneath a loyal exterior," Edward replied gently. Cale made his own choices in how he responded to that old disappointment. He could have spoken honestly of his grievance at any point over the following years. He could have sought reconciliation rather than allowing resentment to calcify into something so destructive. The failure to recognize his pain does not excuse the betrayal he ultimately chose, however much it may help explain the path that led him there. This understanding did not soften Draven's judgment regarding the appropriate consequences for Cale's actions, but it did add a layer of genuine sorrow to what might otherwise have remained pure anger. He found himself, during his final conversation with Cale before the exile was formally executed, speaking with a gentleness that surprised even himself. "I wish you had trusted me enough to speak of this years ago," Draven said quietly, standing once more near the barred window of Cale's holding chamber. "Whatever wound that old decision left in you, I might have addressed it, had I only understood it existed. Instead, you allowed it to grow in silence until it consumed everything we once shared." Cale's expression carried a complicated mixture of lingering bitterness and something that looked almost like genuine regret. "Perhaps I feared that speaking honestly would only confirm what I already suspected, that you valued my service more than my friendship, and that admitting my wound would change nothing beyond exposing a weakness I could not afford you to see." "You will never know now," Draven replied, echoing words he had spoken once before, whether that fear was ever justified, because you chose silence and betrayal instead of the simple courage of honest conversation. That choice remains yours alone to carry, regardless of whatever old grievance first set you upon this path. Cale's situation proved far more complicated to resolve. He remained held in a secure chamber within the castle, and in the days following his exposure, Draven found himself returning repeatedly to conversations with his former friend, seeking to understand fully the resentment that had grown quietly beneath the surface of their relationship, for what must have been years before finally erupting into open betrayal. "You never once spoke to me of these grievances," Draven said during one such visit, standing near the small barred window of the chamber where Cale now spent his days in confinement. 20 years of friendship, and you never once trusted me enough to simply tell me what troubled you." Cale's expression carried a bitter weariness that had replaced the desperate defiance of the night his betrayal had been exposed. "Would it have mattered," he asked quietly, "if I had spoken? You had already made your decisions about succession, about who among your advisors deserved elevation and recognition. My words would have changed nothing, only revealed a weakness I could not afford to show." "You will never know now," Draven replied, "whether speaking honestly might have changed anything, because you chose silence and betrayal instead of trust and honesty. That choice, more than any grievance you carried, is what has brought you to this chamber." These conversations, difficult as they were, gradually revealed the fuller shape of Cale's motivations, a complicated mixture of genuine grievance over perceived slights during past succession discussions, resentment that had festered slowly over years without ever finding healthy expression, and eventually, an ambition that convinced him betrayal represented his only remaining path toward the recognition he believed himself owed. None of it excused what he had done, but it offered Draven a clearer understanding of how loyalty as strong as Cale's had once seemed could eventually curdle into something so destructive. The council ultimately decided against the harshest punishment some nobles had initially demanded, recognizing that Cale's decades of genuine service, however overshadowed now by his final betrayal, deserved some consideration in determining his fate. Instead, he would be stripped permanently of his position and title, exiled from the kingdom's territories with the clear understanding that any attempt to return would result in far harsher consequences than exile alone. It was, Edward argued successfully during the council's deliberation, a punishment severe enough to reflect the seriousness of his betrayal, while avoiding the kind of brutal finality that might create sympathy for him among those who remembered his earlier years of genuine service. Throughout these difficult weeks of negotiation and decision-making, Illyra found herself increasingly drawn into conversations and consultations that extended far beyond her previous role as an unremarkable servant moving quietly through the castle's daily routines. Nathan and Edward both sought her perspective on various aspects of the unfolding situation, recognizing that her careful observations during the crisis had proven remarkably valuable, and gradually she found herself present at meetings and discussions that would have seemed entirely unimaginable to her just a few short weeks earlier. Grace noticed this shift with growing curiosity, though Illyra still found herself unable to explain fully the circumstances that had led to such a dramatic change in her standing within the castle. "You have become something of a mystery," Grace observed one evening, as they shared a rare quiet moment together in the servants' quarters. "First you seemed troubled and distracted for days, and now suddenly you are summoned to meetings with the king's closest advisors. What exactly has happened to you?" Illyra offered her friend a careful smile, wishing she could share the full truth, but understanding that certain details remained too sensitive for casual conversation even now that the immediate crisis had passed. "I simply noticed something that needed to be noticed," she said finally, "and it seems that noticing things has value beyond what I ever imagined it might carry." Grace studied her for a long moment, before shaking her head with a mixture of amusement and lingering curiosity. "Whatever it was, I am glad it worked out well for you. You deserve whatever good fortune has finally found its way to you." Draven, meanwhile, found himself thinking of Illyra with increasing frequency, as the immediate crisis surrounding Cale's betrayal gradually resolved into its final arrangements. Her courage that first night, risking everything to warn him of a danger she could have easily ignored, had planted something that continued growing steadily throughout the weeks that followed, a respect and admiration that had begun, almost without his fully realizing it, to shift into something warmer and more personal than he had initially expected. He found excuses, more often than perhaps strictly necessary, to summon her for continued consultation on matters that Nathan or Edward could easily have handled without her presence, and he noticed, with a mixture of amusement and quiet pleasure, that she seemed to welcome these conversations with a warmth that extended beyond simple professional courtesy. Neither of them spoke directly of whatever was growing between them, both perhaps too cautious, too aware of the vast difference in their positions, to acknowledge it openly. But the growing warmth remained present nonetheless, quiet and patient, waiting for the right moment to fully reveal itself. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the northern mountains with a sharpness that reminded everyone within the kingdom how quickly circumstances could shift from calm to danger without warning. Yet within the castle walls, a different kind of change had settled over daily life, one that most of the household noticed gradually, rather than all at once. The king, always known for his measured formality with the staff who served him, had grown noticeably more approachable in certain quiet moments, particularly whenever a certain dark-haired maid happened to be nearby. Illyra herself struggled to understand exactly what was happening between her and Draven during those weeks. The consultations that had begun purely out of practical necessity during the crisis with Cale had continued long after any genuine need for her insight remained, evolving slowly into something that felt less like formal advisory meetings and more like conversations between two people who simply enjoyed each other's company. She found herself looking forward to these moments with an eagerness that both pleased and unsettled her, uncertain what to make of feelings that seemed entirely inappropriate given the vast difference in their stations. One particularly cold evening, as snow began falling steadily outside the tower windows, Draven summoned her once more to his private study, though this time the pretense of official business felt thinner than ever before. She arrived to find him standing near the fireplace rather than seated at his usual desk, and something in his posture suggested this conversation would carry a different weight than their previous discussions. "I have been considering," he said slowly, without turning from the fire, "how to properly recognize what you did for this kingdom. Nathan has suggested an official commendation before the full council. Edward believes a formal title within the household would properly acknowledge your contribution, without drawing undue attention to the specifics of what actually transpired." Elira waited quietly, uncertain where this conversation was heading, though something in his careful, measured tone suggested he was working his way toward something beyond simple official recognition. "Both suggestions have merit," Draven continued, finally turning to face her directly. "But neither feels entirely adequate to me, if I am honest. What you did required a courage that most people, regardless of their station, could never have managed. You risked everything, with absolutely nothing to gain for yourself, simply because you could not bear to remain silent, while others suffered the consequences of your silence." "I did what I believed was right," Elira said quietly. "I never expected recognition for it." "That," Draven said, taking a step closer, "is precisely what makes you deserving of far more than simple recognition." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts carefully before continuing. "I find myself, in recent weeks, valuing your presence for reasons that extend well beyond the practical usefulness of your observations. I do not know entirely how to navigate what that means, given everything that separates our positions within this kingdom, but I find I no longer wish to simply ignore it." Elira felt her heart racing in a manner entirely different from the fear that had gripped her during those early tense days of the crisis. "I have felt something similar," she admitted quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "though I told myself repeatedly that such feelings were entirely inappropriate given who you are and who I remain." "Who you remain," Draven said gently, "is someone whose courage saved this entire kingdom from devastation, someone whose judgment and character have proven themselves far beyond what any title could properly capture. I do not believe stations should determine entirely who deserves consideration and respect, particularly when that person has already demonstrated qualities that many with far grander titles could never hope to match." The conversation that followed unfolded slowly, carefully, both of them navigating unfamiliar territory with the particular caution of two people who understood that whatever developed between them would need to be handled with tremendous care, given the political complications that any relationship between a king and a former servant would inevitably create among the nobility. Yet despite these practical concerns, something had shifted permanently between them that evening, an acknowledgement of feelings that neither could easily set aside now that they had finally been spoken aloud. In the weeks that followed, Draven moved carefully to establish Elira in a position that would allow their growing relationship room to develop without creating undue scandal or political instability. He appointed her formally as a personal advisor to the crown, a position with genuine responsibilities that justified her continued presence within his closest circle of counsel, while also providing the practical foundation needed for whatever future they might eventually build together. Nathan and Edward, both of whom had witnessed her courage and capability firsthand throughout the crisis, supported this appointment without hesitation, understanding fully that she had earned every measure of the trust and responsibility now being placed upon her. In quieter moments away from the formal responsibilities of her new position, Draven began finding small, careful ways to spend time with Elira that had nothing to do with official business at all. One crisp autumn afternoon, he invited her to walk with him through the castle's eastern gardens, a place he rarely visited without the pressing weight of governance demanding his attention elsewhere. The gardens had grown quiet with the changing season. Most of the summer flowers already faded, but a certain peaceful beauty remained in the bare branches and the soft carpet of fallen leaves covering the winding stone paths. "I used to come here as a boy," Draven admitted as they walked slowly along the path nearest the old fountain, its water now stilled for the coming winter. "Before the weight of ruling ever settled fully upon me, my father would bring me here sometimes, teaching me the names of the different plantings, though I confess I remembered very little of what he taught beyond simply enjoying his company during those quiet afternoons." Elira listened with genuine interest, appreciating this rare glimpse into a version of Draven that existed before the formal weight of kingship had shaped him into the composed, careful ruler she had come to know. "Did you ever imagine, as a boy, what kind of king you might become?" she asked. Draven considered the question thoughtfully before answering. "I imagined many things, most of them far simpler than what governing actually required. I believed strength alone would carry a kingdom forward, that loyalty could be assumed rather than carefully nurtured, that betrayal existed only among distant enemies rather than within one's own closest circle." He paused, glancing toward her with an expression that carried both vulnerability and quiet warmth. I have learned a great deal since those simpler assumptions, much of it through difficult experience, though some of the most valuable lessons have come through knowing you. What have I taught you? Alira asked, genuine curiosity coloring her tone. That governing alone could not? That courage rarely announces itself through grand gestures, Draven replied, but through quiet, trembling choices made by people who never expected to matter at all. That true loyalty requires honesty rather than silent performance, and that the qualities most essential to good leadership, judgment, integrity, genuine care for those one is meant to serve, exist independent of the station someone happens to be born into. They continued walking in comfortable silence for a while after this exchange, both of them absorbing the quiet significance of a conversation that had moved well beyond simple pleasantries into something far more genuine. When they finally paused near the old fountain, Draven turned to face her directly, something earnest and slightly uncertain crossing his expression, an uncertainty that seemed almost endearing given how composed he typically remained in every other circumstance. I find myself wanting to build something lasting with you, he said quietly, beyond simply the practical partnership our current arrangement provides. I understand this desire complicates matters considerably, given everything that separates our stations, and everything the wider council might have to say about such a match. But I find that understanding has done little to diminish the wanting itself. Alira felt her heart swell with an emotion she had not allowed herself to fully name until this exact moment, though it had been growing steadily beneath the surface of their many private conversations over the preceding weeks. I have wanted the same thing, she admitted softly, though I told myself repeatedly that such wanting served no practical purpose, given the vast difference between what we each once were within these castle walls. Perhaps, Draven said, reaching to take her hand gently in his own. It is time we stopped measuring what might grow between us by what we once were, and instead considered simply what we might yet become together, if we are brave enough to build it honestly, regardless of whatever complications that honesty might invite. Grace, upon learning of her friend's remarkable elevation, could barely contain her astonishment and delight. From scrubbing floors to advising the king himself, she said with a mixture of pride and disbelief during one of their now rare quiet moments together. I always knew there was something remarkable about you, Alira, though I confess I never imagined quite this remarkable. Alira laughed, a genuine, easy laugh that carried none of the tension that had defined so much of her recent months. Neither did I, she admitted. Sometimes the most important moments in our lives arrive from directions we never expected, carrying consequences far beyond anything we could have anticipated when we first made the choice that set everything in motion. The formal announcement of her advisory position was made before the full council during the following month, accompanied by a carefully worded explanation that acknowledged her role in uncovering and helping to prevent a serious threat to the kingdom's security, without revealing every specific detail of Kael's betrayal that might have proven too painful or complicated for public discussion. The council, whatever private reservations certain nobles might have harbored about such an unusual elevation, ultimately accepted the appointment without significant resistance, recognizing that questioning the king's judgment on a matter of such clear merit would serve no one's interests. Meanwhile, the political situation with the northern territories continued its slow, careful resolution. The expanded trade agreements Draven had proposed began taking shape through careful negotiation, with Claire, once her own fate had been decided through a combination of restricted movement and formal oversight rather than harsher punishment, playing a surprisingly constructive role in helping establish terms that addressed the genuine hardship her people had endured. It was not a perfect resolution, and tensions between the territories would likely require years of continued careful management to fully heal, but it represented a meaningful step away from the kind of desperate confrontation that had nearly proven catastrophic. Adam and Oliver, both of whom had played crucial roles in uncovering the full scope of Kael's plan, received formal recognition and advancement within the kingdom's military structure, their careful, quiet service finally acknowledged in ways that would shape the remainder of their careers. Oliver in particular found himself grappling with complicated feelings about his own role in the affair, understanding that his willingness to speak honestly with Nathan about Kael's suspicious activities had ultimately proven crucial to preventing disaster, even though it had meant betraying the trust of the commander he had served loyally for years. You did not betray him, Nathan assured Oliver during one conversation, sensing the young warrior's lingering discomfort. You recognize that true loyalty sometimes requires choosing what serves the greater good over what simply pleases the person standing directly above you in rank. Kael forgot that distinction entirely. You never did. As the winter months progressed and the immediate crisis surrounding Kael's betrayal gradually settled into the kingdom's history as a difficult but ultimately overcome challenge, life within the castle slowly returned to a new kind of normalcy, one that incorporated the lessons learned from the near catastrophe without remaining perpetually defined by fear of its repetition. Draven implemented several changes to how the kingdom's security operated, ensuring that no single individual, regardless of their trusted position, would ever again hold enough unchecked authority to potentially compromise the kingdom's safety so completely. He also found himself, in quiet moments away from the demands of governance, increasingly grateful for the strange chain of events that had brought Alira into his life, in circumstances neither of them could have ever anticipated. What had begun as a desperate, frightened act of courage from an unremarkable servant had transformed, through weeks of careful cooperation and growing mutual respect, into something that felt increasingly essential to his own sense of stability and purpose as king. Their relationship developed slowly and carefully throughout the following months, mindful always of the political sensitivities involved, but increasingly confident that the foundation they had built together during the crisis represented something genuine and lasting, rather than simply the temporary intensity of shared danger. Alira continued growing into her role as advisor, her insight and judgment proving valuable across a widening range of the kingdom's concerns, while Draven found himself relying on her counsel, not merely because of political convenience, but because he had come to trust her perspective as thoroughly as he had once trusted Kale's, before ambition and resentment had corrupted that earlier friendship beyond repair. Spring arrived gradually, melting away the last stubborn patches of snow from the castle grounds and bringing with it a sense of renewal that seemed to mirror the kingdom's own slow recovery from the crisis of the previous winter. The training yards filled once more with the sounds of soldiers practicing their drills, merchants returned to the markets with fresh goods from territories that had reopened their trade routes, and throughout the castle, a lightness had returned to daily life that had been noticeably absent during the tense months following Kale's exposure. Not everyone within the kingdom had accepted the changes of the past season with equal grace, however. Among the nobility, a small but vocal faction led by a proud traditionalist lord named Peter continued to express private reservations about Alira's elevated position, viewing her rapid rise from servant to trusted advisor as a dangerous precedent that threatened the established order they believed essential to the kingdom's stability. Peter had said nothing directly to the king on the matter, understanding the political risk of openly challenging a decision Draven had made so decisively, but his quiet influence among certain circles of the nobility had created undercurrents of resistance that occasionally surfaced during council discussions. Matters came to a head during a spring council session convened to discuss the finalization of the trade agreements with the northern territories, agreements that Alira had played a significant role in helping shape through her careful attention to detail and her surprising insight into the practical concerns of common people that many longtime nobles had never fully considered. When the proposal came before the full council for formal approval, Peter raised his voice in open objection for the first time since Alira's appointment. "I do not question the courage this young woman displayed during the crisis with Kale," Peter said carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone who understood he was walking a delicate political line. But courage in a moment of danger does not automatically qualify someone for the ongoing responsibility of shaping the kingdom's foreign policy. Her insight into common concerns, however well-intentioned, cannot substitute for the years of formal training and experience that such weighty decisions properly require. A tense silence fell over the council chamber as Peter's words hung in the air, the first open challenge to Alira's position since her appointment months earlier. Alira felt her pulse quicken, old insecurities about her humble origins rising briefly to the surface despite the confidence she had built over the preceding months. But she forced herself to remain calm, understanding that how she responded in this moment would matter far more than any defensive reaction might accomplish. Before Draven could intervene, Alira rose from her seat, addressing the council directly with a steady voice that carried none of the nervousness she felt internally. "Lord Peter raises a fair concern," she said, "and I will not pretend that my path to this position followed the traditional route that most advisors before me have taken. But I would ask the council to consider this. The threat that nearly destroyed our kingdom last winter was uncovered not through years of formal training or established protocol, but through the simple willingness of an ordinary person to notice something wrong and refuse to remain silent about it. Perhaps our kingdom benefits from having voices at this table who understand not only the formal mechanisms of governance, but the everyday concerns of the people those mechanisms are ultimately meant to serve." She continued, outlining specific details of the trade agreement under discussion, explaining with careful precision how certain provisions would directly benefit common farmers and merchants along the border territories, provisions she had helped develop specifically because her own background gave her insight into concerns that might have otherwise been overlooked by advisors who had never experienced such hardship personally. Her presentation was thorough, well-reasoned, and delivered with a confidence that visibly impressed several council members, who had previously remained neutral on the question of her suitability for the role. When she finished, silence lingered for a moment before Edward, whose decades of experience carried considerable weight among the assembled nobles, spoke in clear support. "I have served this kingdom through 3 different reigns," he said, "and I can say without hesitation that the insight Lady Alira has brought to our deliberations these past months has proven more valuable than that of advisors who held far grander titles before her. Perhaps it is time we recognize that wisdom and capability do not always arrive wearing the garments tradition expects them to wear." Peter, recognizing that the momentum of the room had shifted decisively away from his position, offered a measured acknowledgement rather than continuing his objection further, understanding that pressing the matter beyond this point would only diminish his own standing among colleagues who had clearly been persuaded by Alira's capable defense of her position. The trade agreement passed with overwhelming support, and more importantly, the incident marked a turning point in how the wider council viewed Alira's presence among them, transforming lingering skepticism into genuine, if sometimes reluctant, respect. Draven watched this entire exchange with quiet pride, resisting the urge to intervene directly on her behalf, understanding that her ability to defend her own position through reasoned argument, rather than relying on his authority to silence critics, mattered enormously for establishing her credibility, independent of their personal relationship. Afterward, in the privacy of his study, he could not help but express his admiration openly. "You did not need me to defend you at all," he said, genuine pride evident in his voice. "You handled Peter's challenge better than I could have managed myself." "I have spent my entire life being underestimated," Alira replied with a small smile. "It seems I have grown rather practiced at proving people wrong." As spring gave way to early summer, the kingdom continued its steady recovery from the crisis of the previous winter, the trade agreements with the northern territories beginning to yield tangible benefits for communities on both sides of the border that had suffered under years of strained relations. Claire, whose own role in the affair had been resolved through careful negotiation rather than harsh punishment, proved an unexpectedly capable partner in ensuring the agreements functioned smoothly, her first-hand understanding of her people's genuine hardships, helping to identify practical solutions that pure diplomatic theory might have overlooked. Kale, exiled from the kingdom's territories entirely, disappeared into obscurity somewhere beyond the borders he had once helped defend, his fate unknown to most within the castle beyond the basic knowledge that he had been permanently stripped of position and standing. Draven thought of him occasionally, particularly during quiet moments when memories of their younger years together surfaced unbidden, but he had learned, through the difficult months of processing the betrayal, to hold those memories without allowing them to poison his present happiness or his ongoing responsibilities as king. The formal announcement of Draven's intention to court Alira openly, rather than continuing the careful discretion that had characterized their relationship throughout the preceding months, came during the traditional midsummer gathering, a celebration second in importance only to the full moon ceremonies that marked the changing seasons. Standing before the assembled nobility and common household members gathered in the great hall, Draven spoke with a directness that left no room for ambiguity about his intentions. "Many of you know the story of how a servant's courage prevented a catastrophe that could have devastated this kingdom entirely," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "What some of you may not yet fully understand is how deeply that courage and the character behind it has come to matter to me personally, beyond simply the practical service it provided our kingdom. I intend to court Lady Alira openly, with the full knowledge and, I hope, the support of this council and this household, understanding that whatever differences exist in the paths that brought each of us to this moment, true partnership requires nothing more than mutual respect, shared values, and genuine trust." The response from the gathered crowd carried more warmth than Draven had perhaps anticipated, the story of Alira's courage having already earned her considerable goodwill among common household members who understood intimately the courage required for someone in her original position to risk everything for the greater good. Grace, standing among the servants near the back of the hall, could not contain her tears of joy for her friend, understanding better than almost anyone else present exactly how remarkable a journey Alira had traveled since that terrifying night when she first slipped a warning note into the king's palm. In the months that followed, their courtship developed publicly, with the same careful, genuine warmth that had characterized their private relationship throughout the preceding season. Alira continued her work as advisor to the crown, her role expanding gradually as her capabilities and judgment proved themselves repeatedly across an increasingly wide range of the kingdom's concerns, while Draven found himself governing with a renewed sense of purpose and stability that the painful lessons of Kale's betrayal had ultimately helped forge, however difficult the path toward that stability had proven to be. The kingdom itself emerged from the ordeal stronger than it had been before, its security arrangements reformed to prevent any single individual from ever again holding the kind of unchecked authority that had made Cale's betrayal possible. Its relationship with the Northern Territories transformed from tension and suspicion into genuine, mutually beneficial partnership, and its understanding of true loyalty deepened by the painful recognition that the strongest bonds require honesty and trust, rather than silent resentment left to fester unaddressed. And Illyra, once an unremarkable maid who moved through the castle's halls entirely unseen by those around her, had found her own remarkable place within that transformed kingdom, not through the wealth or status she had never possessed, but through the simple, enduring courage of a young woman who could not bear to remain silent while others suffered the consequences of a truth she alone had discovered. Her story, whispered first among the servants who had known her before her elevation, and gradually shared throughout the wider kingdom as the full details of the crisis eventually became known, served as a lasting reminder to everyone who heard it that true worth had never depended on the station one was born into, but on the choices one made when courage was required, and silence would have been so much easier to choose instead. A full year passed before the kingdom faced its final test regarding the events of that fateful winter, arriving in a form none of them had fully anticipated. Word reached the castle through Adam, now elevated to the position of chief scout following his crucial role in uncovering Cale's plan, that a small band of warriors had been spotted moving through the forests near the eastern border. Warriors whose markings suggested loyalty not to the Northern Territories that had since become genuine allies, but to Cale himself, who had apparently spent his exile gathering a handful of desperate followers, willing to attempt one final act of vengeance against the king who had exposed him. Draven received this news with a grim determination rather than surprise, having always suspected that a man as prideful as Cale might struggle to accept his fall from grace without at least one final attempt to reclaim what he believed himself owed. He convened his council swiftly, and this time Illyra sat among them not as a curiosity or a recent addition requiring justification, but as a full and respected member of the kingdom's leadership. Her counsel sought as naturally as anyone else present. "He will not attempt another open confrontation," Illyra observed during the council's discussion, drawing on the deep understanding of Cale's character she had developed through the painful events of the previous winter. "He knows now that open betrayal failed him once already. Whatever he intends, it will likely rely on subtlety rather than force, perhaps an attempt to reach someone within the castle who might still carry sympathy for his cause, or some quieter method of striking at what he believes matters most to the king who exiled him." Her words proved prophetic within days. A servant recently hired to help with the kitchen's expanding needs was discovered attempting to slip a concealed blade into a delivery meant for the private quarters where Draven and Illyra had, by then, established a shared household following their formal marriage earlier that spring. The servant, questioned carefully by Nathan, revealed under gentle but persistent interrogation that Cale had approached him weeks earlier, offering considerable payment in exchange for a single opportunity to strike at the king directly, believing that removing Draven might create enough chaos within the kingdom's leadership to allow Cale some path back toward the position and respect he still believed himself owed. The plot, discovered before it could unfold into anything more than a foiled attempt, led swiftly to Cale's final capture just beyond the eastern border, where Nathan led a small, decisive force to apprehend him and his few remaining followers before they could attempt any further schemes against the kingdom. This time there would be no possibility of continued exile with its lingering hope of eventual redemption. Cale's second betrayal, this one aimed directly at ending Draven's life rather than simply opening a gate to distant enemies, left the council with little room for anything beyond the most severe judgment available under the kingdom's laws. Draven visited him one final time before that judgment was carried out, standing once more before a barred window, though this time the conversation carried none of the lingering sorrow that had characterized their earlier exchanges. "You had every opportunity to build a different life beyond these walls," Draven said quietly. "Instead, you chose to spend your exile plotting further destruction, proving beyond any doubt that whatever friendship we once shared has been entirely consumed by ambition that recognizes no boundary, not even the sanctity of the very life you once swore to protect." Cale offered no defense this time, no explanation rooted in old grievances or unhealed wounds, only a bitter silence that spoke more clearly than any words could have managed about how completely resentment had hollowed out whatever remained of the loyal friend Draven had once known. Draven left that final conversation with a clarity he had not possessed during their earlier exchanges, understanding now that some wounds, once allowed to fester long enough, could never be healed through simple recognition or reconciliation, no matter how genuinely such recognition might be offered. The kingdom's recovery from this final chapter proved swifter than anyone might have expected, perhaps because the earlier crisis had already forced such thorough reform of the kingdom's security and governance that the structures needed to weather this second, smaller threat had already been firmly established. Nathan's expanded network of quiet observation, initially developed to protect Alira during the tense weeks before the ceremony, had grown into a permanent, carefully managed system that ensured no future threat, however subtle, could develop unnoticed for long within the castle's walls. Alira, now carrying the formal title of queen alongside her continued role advising on matters that extended well beyond traditional expectations for her position, found herself reflecting often on the strange, winding path that had carried her from an unremarkable servant girl to the partner of the very king whose life she had once risked everything to protect. She thought during these quiet moments of reflection of her mother's old words about courage requiring action despite fear, rather than the absence of fear altogether, understanding now more fully than ever how completely those words had shaped the entire course of her life. Grace, who had remained close to Alira throughout every stage of her remarkable transformation, eventually accepted a position as head of the household staff, a role that allowed her to maintain their friendship while also recognizing her own considerable talents for managing the complex daily operations of castle life. Daniel continued his work in the stables, though he now held the added responsibility of training the castle's growing cavalry under Nathan's supervision, his easy friendship with Alira remaining a source of genuine comfort throughout every season of change that followed. The kingdom itself continued its steady growth and stability in the years that followed, its relationship with the Northern Territories deepening into genuine partnership rather than merely tolerant coexistence, its internal governance strengthened by the hard lessons learned through Cale's betrayal and its aftermath. Peter, the traditionalist lord who had once challenged Alira's suitability for her advisory role, eventually became one of her most consistent supporters within the council, having witnessed firsthand over several years exactly how much value her unconventional path to leadership had brought to decisions that affected every level of the kingdom's population. Years later, when Alira spoke to her own children about the winter that had first brought her into the king's private study, trembling with fear yet unwilling to remain silent about the danger she had discovered, she found herself emphasizing not the fear she had felt in that moment, nor even the remarkable transformation that had followed, but the simple, essential choice that had set everything else in motion. Courage, she told them, rarely announced itself with grand fanfare or clear certainty about the outcome it might produce. More often, it arrived as a quiet, trembling decision to act despite overwhelming uncertainty, made by an ordinary person who understood, in the deepest part of themselves, that silence would have cost far more than any risk that honesty might demand. And so the story of the maid who slipped a secret note into the hand of an alpha king became woven permanently into the fabric of the kingdom's history, told and retold not merely as a tale of political intrigue and betrayal overcome, but as a lasting testament to the truth that the most important moments in any life often arrive disguised as small, frightening choices, made in quiet corridors where no one else is watching, by people who have never once considered themselves capable of changing the course of anything at all.